For that, we're joined by, William Hildebrandt. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Mark. Let's begin with a look at the deficit here in France. Prime Minister Manuel Valls is under pressure from within his own party to tweak his proposal to make 50 billion euros in cuts. Rebel Socialist MPs oppose freezing all state pensions and welfare benefits, but Valls is trying to win their support before the plan goes to Parliament April 29th. Now, earlier today, the government revised its growth forecasts up to levels that French Finance Minister Michel Sapin coined as reasonable. But critics fear the government is basing budget plans over over-optimistic growth forecasts, which could in turn lead to a higher deficit later on. Let's take a moment now to listen to what the head of the hardline CGT union had to say.
Who is going to help us repay the debt? If we have no growth, if we have no employment, no pay rises for civil servants, like for the past 7 years, if we continue giving money to businesses without measuring its effect, of course the debt will be a barrier to economic and social development.
Let's stay here in France. Earlier today, Michel Sapin, the French finance minister, called on banks to be more civic and willing to help entrepreneurs. He's previously criticized the banks for not taking a more active role in helping the economy recover. Some entrepreneurs who've been brushed away by these banks, though, have begun to turn to crowdfunding for their projects. Delano de Souza has more.
Jean-Christophe Menz, the co-founder of Cook & Go, is inspecting his new workshop. He turned to crowdfunding to raise 700,000 euros to fund his company's expansion in France.
Banks like financing this, construction, material, because it's tangible. But to finance things that aren't material like human resources, development, IT, etc., then we turn to investment funds.
On average, 3 out of 10 crowdfunded projects fail. Investors usually come from the business community and they realize they're betting on a risk.
It's a gamble. It can work. There can be benefits one day, which will be distributed. But it can also not work. So it's a gamble.
Services are available over the internet to place entrepreneurs in contact with investors. This team has received 400 applications from small and medium-sized companies in the past year, and only 16 received funding.
We filter out companies according to the sector, how new it is. And we carry out an audit as well, looking at various aspects, such as monthly costs, how much money they want to raise. Does their plan make sense?
In 2013 alone, investors in crowdfunded projects raised 78 million euros in France. There are hopes that number will increase. France's parliament is expected to pass reforms to encourage this alternative means of financing before summer.
Let's move now to Russia, where Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev warned that financial sanctions imposed on his country in response to the Ukrainian crisis could not go unpunished. He added that Russia must set up an international payment system that would rival Visa and MasterCard after those companies withdrew their services from several Russian banks. Medvedev also pledged support for Russian companies affected by the sanctions. Let's take a listen.
Businesses will receive necessary protection should unfriendly actions such as sanctions be taken against them. Our companies have to learn to work in conditions of fierce competition, regardless of any sanctions. The economy is global, but companies have to operate by conditions of competition and not by the politically motivated economic war.
That Ukrainian crisis has been affecting the markets, but there's no dampening the U.S. today. Let's take a look there. Stocks are up in the U.S. The S&P 500 is set for its 6th day of gains. Investors still digesting a slew of earning reports, trading bolstered by figures from Netflix and Harley-Davidson, both of whom topped expectations. In Europe, markets finished up also. The healthcare sector surged 3%, highlighted by a deal between Novartis and GlaxoSmithKline. The two groups are swapping assets in an M&A deal worth more than $23 billion. Well, time now to look at some company news briefly. The world's second biggest fast food chain missed expectations. McDonald's said its profits dropped 5.2% for the first 3 months of the year. Earnings fell 4% to $1.21 per share. The company wants to strengthen its menu offerings and is focusing on stabilizing its key markets, including the US, Germany, Australia, and Japan. And Tesla Motors made its first delivery in China. The U.S. manufacturer handed over 8 all-electric sedans at a launch event in Beijing. The company plans to build a nationwide network of charging stations and service centers as soon as possible, a venture that could cost hundreds of millions of dollars. That's all for the business news now. I'll be back in 1 hour with more for you. Back to you, Mark.
People around the world will making that a date. William Hildebrandt there with the business, as he says, back in just over an hour's time. Time now to turn our attention to sport.